Is the palace really closing the door on Meghan Markle forever, or is this the moment everything quietly changes? Because 5 minutes ago, something happened that didn't look dramatic. No flashing lights, no emergency press conference, no trembling voice behind a podium, just a few carefully chosen words released into the world. And yet those words landed like a thunderclap for anyone who knows how royal power actually works. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. At first glance, it looked routine, almost boring. Another palace update, another carefully sanitized line meant to keep the machine moving and the public calm. But here's the problem. The palace does not speak unless it has to, and it never confirms anything by accident. So when this update appeared, wrapped in neutral language and emotional distance, insiders didn't ask what it said. They asked why it was said at all, because behind the calm tone, behind the formal phrasing, behind the deliberate lack of warmth, there was something else hiding in plain sight. A signal, a quiet acknowledgement that something has reached a breaking point. And the tragic part? It may not be what you think. Most people heard tragic news and assumed it meant sympathy, loss, compassion, a door opening in response to pain. But what if the tragedy wasn't about grief, but about finality? What if the tragedy was that an entire chapter of royal possibility had just been closed, permanently, with no ceremony and no chance for appeal? Ask yourself this: why now? Why confirm anything at all? After years of refusing to clarify, correct, or engage? Why speak in the middle of swirling rumors about a possible return, reconciliation, or behind-the-scenes contact? And why choose language that feels emotionally hollow at the exact moment when emotion would be expected? That contradiction is where this story begins. Because while the public was distracted by speculation, sources say something else was happening quietly. No photographers, no leaks, no dramatic gestures, just conversations that never made headlines. Messages that didn't get replies, intermediaries who were suddenly very careful about what they would and would not carry across invisible lines. This wasn't about forgiveness, and it wasn't about revenge. It was about control. For years, the narrative around Meghan has been loud, emotional, and chaotic. Interviews, podcasts, documentaries, open wounds, public grievances aired in front of a global audience. But institutions like the monarchy don't operate in chaos. They operate in time, long time, slow time, the kind of time where silence is not absence, it's strategy. And that's what makes this moment dangerous. Because for the first time in a long while, the palace didn't just stay silent. It acknowledged something. Not fully, not emotionally, but just enough to let the world know that an internal decision had already been made. Here's what most people miss. When the palace wants to soften a blow, it uses warmth. When it wants to keep options open, it uses ambiguity. But when it wants to close a chapter without provoking backlash, it uses distance. Formality, language that feels almost cold. That's exactly what happened here, which raises an uncomfortable question. Was this update really about Meghan's future, or about the palace protecting its own? Because according to multiple accounts, this moment didn't come out of nowhere. It followed months of subtle repositioning, a noticeable change in tone, a shift in emphasis, public gestures that seemed friendly on the surface but lacked follow-through behind the scenes. And behind all of that was a rumor that refused to die, a so-called secret return plan. Not a triumphant comeback, not a balcony moment, not even a public reconciliation, but something smaller, quieter, controlled. A test, not a promise, a foot in the door rather than a seat at the table. The idea, according to those familiar with the conversations, wasn't about restoring titles or rewriting history. It was about relevance, about access, about whether any relationship, however limited, could still exist between Meghan and the institution she once walked away from so publicly. But here's where the story turns. Because the palace doesn't negotiate in public, and it doesn't respond well to pressure. Especially pressure that looks emotional, reactive, or tied to public image management. From the palace's perspective, that kind of approach isn't vulnerability. It's volatility. And volatility is the one thing institutions fear more than scandal. So while some believed the tragic update signaled empathy, others saw something else entirely. A line drawn, a boundary reinforced, a way of saying, we see what's happening, and we are choosing not to engage. That's the hidden motive most people aren't talking about. This wasn't about Meghan being welcomed back in. It was about making sure she couldn't claim she was. Think about it. If a return plan truly existed, why acknowledge anything now? Why not let speculation burn itself out? Why risk inflaming tensions by confirming a tragic shift at the exact moment rumors of rebuilding ties were gaining traction? Unless the goal wasn't to explain, but to preempt. To quietly shut down expectations before they became demands. To ensure that whatever happens next, it can't be framed as rejection, only as reality. And that's where the tragedy comes in. Not personal tragedy, not emotional tragedy, institutional tragedy. The tragedy of a door that doesn't slam, it simply stops opening. For Meghan, that distinction matters more than any headline, because a slammed door can be challenged. A locked door can be negotiated. But a door that no longer exists? There's nothing to knock on. Which brings us to the most unsettling part of all. According to sources close to the situation, Meghan didn't approach this moment loudly. She didn't issue demands. She didn't make public ultimatums. Instead, she shifted tactics, lowered the temperature, adjusted the message, quietly signaled a willingness to rebuild, not on her terms, but on theirs. And that may have been exactly what came too late. Because institutions don't respond to desperation, they respond to leverage. And leverage, once lost, is almost impossible to regain. So when the palace released that update, insiders didn't interpret it as a reaction to Meghan's moves. They saw it as insulation, a way of protecting the institution from future narratives that could paint it as cruel, unresponsive, or obstructive. In other words, the palace wasn't answering Meghan, it was answering the future. And the answer was chilling in its simplicity. Whatever bridge once existed is no longer structurally sound. Now here's the question you should be asking yourself. If the palace has already made its decision, why do some insiders say conversations are still happening? Why do certain intermediaries remain active? And why does the language of the update leave just enough room for doubt that people are still arguing about what it really means? Because the story isn't over. Not yet. But the next move may not belong to Meghan at all. And what comes next, the moment that forces everything into the open, is something no one outside the palace walls was supposed to notice. What if the most powerful sentence in this entire story wasn't emotional at all? What if it was cold, technical, and so carefully constructed that most people skimmed right past it? While insiders froze the moment they read it. Because when the palace released its statement, the public reacted to the headline, commentators debated tone. Social media argued about intention. Supporters and critics fell back into familiar camps. But inside royal circles, that wasn't the conversation. The real conversation was about a single line, a line that looked harmless, almost forgettable. The kind of sentence designed not to trend, not to provoke, not to inflame. And that's exactly why it mattered. Because the palace doesn't write filler. Every word is weighed. Every clause is negotiated. Every comma is intentional. So let's slow this down. Let's strip the statement of emotion, of assumptions, of projection, and look at it the way the institution intended it to be read. Not as reassurance, but as positioning. The statement didn't begin with sympathy. That alone raised eyebrows. Traditionally, when the palace wants to soften a message, it leads with empathy, acknowledgement, a nod to shared humanity. Even when the message is firm, it's usually wrapped in warmth. That didn't happen here. Instead, the opening framed the update as procedural, almost administrative. It wasn't "we understand." It wasn't "we recognize." It wasn't even "we remain mindful." It was closer to "this is the status." That distinction is crucial because procedure is how institutions create distance. It removes personality. It removes blame. It removes negotiation. Procedure says, this isn't about you, it's about the system. And the system has already decided. Now here's where the language becomes even more revealing. The statement referenced the future, but only in abstract terms. No timelines, no pathways, no contingencies. Just a carefully neutral acknowledgement that things are, in effect, where they are. No ongoing discussions, no open channels, no continued engagement. Those phrases matter because they are the palace's escape hatches. They are the linguistic equivalents of keeping a door cracked open. They allow flexibility, they buy time. They invite interpretation. Their absence is not accidental. In royal communications, what's not said often carries more weight than what is. And in this case, the silence around process was deafening, which brings us to the word that sent shockwaves through insiders. Confirmed. Not noted, not acknowledged, confirmed. That single word changes the power dynamic entirely, because confirmation implies finality. It suggests that whatever was once fluid has now solidified. That internal conversations, the ones the public never sees, have reached a conclusion. And here's the part that most people missed. The palace didn't confirm a return. It didn't confirm a rejection. It confirmed an update about the future. That may sound vague, but it's actually precise. In palace language, the future is not hypothetical, it's planned, structured. The future is something the institution manages, not something it waits for. So when the palace confirms an update about someone's future, it is effectively saying, this trajectory has been decided and it is no longer under discussion. That's why insiders reacted so strongly. Because if there truly were active talks, tentative plans, or even a probationary pathway being explored, confirmation would be premature. It would box the palace in. It would remove flexibility. Institutions avoid that at all costs, unless flexibility is no longer needed. Now let's talk about timing. This statement didn't drop in a vacuum. It came amid renewed speculation about behind-the-scenes outreach, about intermediaries, about quiet attempts to recalibrate relationships, about a possible soft re-entry into UK life, not as a working royal, but as something adjacent, something controlled. Those rumors had momentum, and momentum is dangerous for the palace. Because once expectations start forming publicly, the institution loses control of the narrative. It risks being seen as reactive instead of authoritative, compassionate instead of deliberate. So what do you do when speculation starts to outrun your comfort level? You don't deny it outright. That invites confrontation. You don't confirm it. That creates obligation. You issue a statement that sounds neutral, but functions as a stop sign. That's what this was. A narrative circuit breaker. By confirming a tragic update, the palace redirected the conversation away from possibility and toward inevitability. It reframed the story not as one of negotiation, but as one of acceptance. And that's a subtle but devastating shift, because acceptance implies there's nothing left to argue about. Now consider the emotional contradiction at the heart of this. The word tragic suggests loss, sympathy, fact, pain. But the structure of the statement offered none of that. No expressions of sorrow, no acknowledgement of personal struggle, no humanizing language at all. It was tragedy without tears. And that's not accidental either. In palace communications, emotional language is used sparingly and strategically. When it's absent, it signals that emotion is not the point. The point is closure, which leads us to the most unsettling interpretation circulating among insiders. That this statement wasn't written for the public at all. It was written for Meghan. Not as a message of comfort, but as a boundary. A way of saying, whatever you believe might still be possible, understand this. We are moving forward without you. And that brings us to the question no one wants to ask out loud. If the palace has already confirmed its internal position, why do we keep hearing about ongoing conversations? Why do sources still whisper about intermediaries, about feelers, about last-ditch efforts to recalibrate? The answer may be uncomfortable, because not all conversations are negotiations. Some are simply acknowledgments of reality. Sometimes, when an institution has made up its mind, it still allows communication, not to reopen doors, but to manage fallout, to soften transitions, to prevent misinterpretation, to ensure that when the story finally ends, it ends on the institution's terms. And that's where the single most chilling line comes in. Buried near the end of the statement was a clause that seemed routine, almost boilerplate, the kind of sentence editors skim over. But insiders noticed something was missing. There was no reference to future reassessment, no mention of review, no suggestion that circumstances could evolve. It was written in the past tense, even when talking about what lies ahead. That's rare, and it's telling, because when the palace believes a situation is genuinely unresolved, it leaves itself linguistic escape routes. It builds in ambiguity. It protects optionality. Here, there was none, which means this wasn't an update. It was an endpoint disguised as one. Now pause for a moment and ask yourself, if you were Meghan, reading that statement, how would it land? Would it feel like compassion? Or would it feel like being formally written out of a future you thought you might still negotiate? That's the tragedy insiders are talking about. Not the loss of status, not the loss of titles, but the loss of relevance. The realization that the institution you once defined yourself against has quietly moved on and no longer needs to respond. And here's where the story deepens. Because sources say Meghan didn't expect this. She expected resistance, pushback, even hostility. What she didn't expect was finality. And finality is much harder to fight. Which brings us to what happened next. Because after the statement was released, something changed behind the scenes. Conversations shifted tone. Intermediaries became cautious. Messages slowed. And one particular phrase, uttered privately by a senior royal, began circulating among insiders. A phrase that reframes everything. A phrase that suggests the palace isn't worried about what Meghan might do next, because it believes the most important move has already been made. And once you hear that phrase, the entire strategy becomes clear. But that's where we'll stop for now, because what that senior royal allegedly said, and who they said it to, is the key to understanding why the statement wasn't the beginning of a conversation. It was the end of one. Why did they choose that word? Out of all the language available to the palace, restrained, diplomatic, endlessly rehearsed language, why did they land on tragic? Because that single word did more emotional work than the rest of the statement combined. And it may also be the most misunderstood part of this entire saga. To the public, tragic reads as sympathetic, heavy, personal. It suggests heartbreak, loss, maybe even cruelty. It invites empathy. It frames the subject as someone to be pitied, or at least understood. But inside the palace, tragic means something very different. It does not mean sad. It does not mean unfair. And it certainly does not mean accidental. In royal communications, tragic is a word of containment. It signals inevitability. Something regrettable, yes, but also unavoidable. Something that should not be argued with because it has already happened. And that's where this story takes a turn most people didn't expect, because sources say there was intense debate over that word, not about whether the update should be released. That decision had already been made, but about how it should be framed, how much humanity to allow in, how much distance to maintain. Some argued for neutral phrasing, others wanted something colder, more procedural. And then there were those who insisted on tragic. Why? Because tragic disarms. It takes the oxygen out of outrage. It softens the public response without offering solutions. It encourages resignation rather than rebellion. Think about it. When you hear tragic, your instinct isn't to demand change. It's to sigh, to accept, to say, well, that's awful, and move on. That reaction is not accidental. Now here's where things get uncomfortable. According to multiple insiders, the tragedy referenced in the statement was not meant to describe Meghan's emotional state. It wasn't about her pain, her struggle, or her personal losses. It was about the situation itself, the breakdown, the outcome, the fact that things reached a point where this update had to exist at all. In other words, the tragedy wasn't what happened to her. The tragedy was that the institution and Meghan had reached a place where reconciliation was no longer a viable narrative. That's a very different framing, and once you see it that way, the rest of the language snaps into focus. There is no promise embedded in tragic. There is no hope. It's a word that closes stories, not opens them. It belongs in eulogies, not negotiations. Which raises a critical question. If the palace believed there was still a meaningful path forward, why choose a word that implies finality? The answer lies in timing. This statement came at a moment when public sympathy was in flux, when narratives were colliding, when speculation about Meghan's future was reaching a fever pitch again. The palace needed a way to recalibrate the emotional temperature without escalating conflict. Tragic does that perfectly. It acknowledges pain without assigning blame. It communicates seriousness without inviting debate. And most importantly, it reframes the story from action to outcome. Once something is tragic, it's already happened. Now consider the contradiction this creates. On the surface, tragic feels humanizing. It sounds like concern, like recognition. But structurally, it strips the subject of agency. It says, this is unfortunate, but it is what it is. And for someone like Meghan, whose public identity has long been tied to voice, agency, and narrative control, that is a devastating repositioning. She is no longer the driver of the story. She is its consequence. Insiders say this is why the word caused such unease internally. Some worried it would be read as patronizing. Others feared it would spark backlash, but those concerns were overruled. Because the primary audience for this word was not the public. It was internal. It was the media. It was future historians. And it was Meghan herself. Tragic is a word that says, this chapter has ended badly, and we regret that it did, but we are not reopening it. And here's the detail most people missed. In past palace statements involving family tension, tragedy has almost always been paired with reassurance, with language about ongoing support, enduring bonds, or future reconciliation. That didn't happen here. The word stood alone, isolated, unbuffered, which is almost unheard of. That isolation is the tell. It suggests that the palace wanted to mark this moment without cushioning it, without implying repair, without suggesting that time would heal it. Instead, it wanted to acknowledge damage and then move past it. That's not empathy. That's documentation. Now let's talk about who pushed back, because not everyone inside the system agreed this was wise. According to sources, there were concerns about optics, about how tragic might be interpreted in a digital age obsessed with emotional nuance, about whether it could be weaponized by critics, but ultimately, those concerns lost out to something else: clarity. The palace, insiders say, wanted the record to reflect that it had recognized the gravity of the situation without conceding ground. Tragic allows that. It says, we see the damage, but we are not responsible for fixing it. And that brings us to the most revealing part of all. The palace did not specify what was tragic. That omission is everything. By leaving the subject vague, it allowed multiple interpretations, all of which serve the institution. Supporters could read it as compassion. Critics could read it as dismissal. Neutral observers could read it as sadness without action. And Meghan? She was left to wonder what exactly the palace was calling tragic. Her choices? Her circumstances? Her future? Or the impossibility of reintegration? That ambiguity is not kindness. It's power. Because when you control the frame but not the explanation, you force the other party to respond from a position of uncertainty. And uncertainty weakens leverage. Now consider this. If Meghan were truly being quietly welcomed back into some form of relationship, even a limited one, would the palace describe the situation as tragic? Or would it use language that suggests complexity, evolution, or mutual effort? The answer is obvious. Tragic implies there is no mutual effort left. Which is why insiders say the word was less about sentiment and more about signaling. It signaled to staff, to courtiers, to allies, prepare for a future where this relationship does not resume. It signaled to the press, adjust expectations. And it signaled to Meghan, whatever conversations may still be happening, they are not about return. They are about resolution. That distinction matters more than any headline, because resolution does not lead to reconciliation. It leads to closure. And closure is the one thing Meghan may not have anticipated. Here's where the emotional stakes rise. Sources say Meghan believed that time was on her side, that public fatigue would soften resistance, that quiet outreach would eventually be met with pragmatic compromise. What she may not have realized is that time works differently inside institutions. Silence does not mean indecision. It means preparation. And tragic is the word you use when preparation is complete. Now pause and ask yourself, if you were reading this statement from the outside, would you feel encouraged to hope for a second act? Or would you feel gently, almost politely told to let go? That's the brilliance and the cruelty of the word. It doesn't provoke, it pacifies. And in doing so, it robs the subject of momentum. Which brings us to the next development, because after the statement circulated, reactions behind the scenes were immediate. Not explosive, not dramatic, but unmistakable. Tone shifted. Doors that had been slightly ajar closed quietly, and one senior figure reportedly summed it up in a single sentence that explains why tragic was chosen, and why it may mark the point of no return. That sentence didn't appear in the statement. It wasn't meant for the public. But once you hear it, everything makes sense. And that's where we're heading next. When did she realize the rules had changed? Not when the headlines turned colder, not when commentators stopped speculating about reconciliation, not even when the palace statement landed with that unmistakable chill. According to people familiar with the timeline, the moment came earlier than anyone expected. And it happened quietly, without cameras, without confrontation, without drama. It happened when a message didn't come back. Because for the first time since leaving the UK, Meghan adjusted her approach. And it didn't work. For years, her strategy had been unmistakable. Speak openly, control the narrative. Force engagement through visibility. When institutions refuse to respond, public pressure becomes the lever. Interviews become bargaining chips. Silence becomes an accusation. That strategy defined the post-exit era. But something shifted, subtly at first, almost imperceptibly, a change in tone that most viewers didn't register but insiders immediately clocked. Fewer sweeping statements, less defiance, more ambiguity, more restraint. The message changed from "look what they did to me" to "let's move forward." And that wasn't accidental. Sources say Meghan understood something fundamental had changed around her. Public sympathy was no longer guaranteed. Fatigue had set in. The endless cycle of revelations and rebuttals had lost its edge. More importantly, the palace wasn't reacting anymore. Not defensively, not angrily, not at all. And when an institution stops reacting, it's rarely because it's losing. It's because it has already decided. So Meghan pivoted. Instead of speaking louder, she spoke softer. Instead of broadcasting grievances, she focused on signaling stability, continuity, maturity, the kind of emotional recalibration that suggests readiness for dialogue rather than conflict. And behind the scenes, that shift went further. The outreach became indirect. No grand gestures, no dramatic apologies, no public overtures that would force the palace's hand. Just quiet feelers, carefully chosen intermediaries, people who could plausibly approach without alarming the institution, individuals with enough credibility to be heard and enough distance to maintain deniability. This was not about asking to return as she once was. This was about asking if there was any version of connection left at all. And that's where things began to unravel, because the palace does not respond to tone shifts. It responds to structure, to process, to hierarchy. And Meghan's new approach, while more restrained, still misunderstood. One critical thing. From the palace's perspective, the relationship was no longer personal, it was historical. Which means gestures, however sincere, were being filtered through precedent, not emotion. So when messages came in, soft, respectful, non-confrontational, they didn't trigger conversation, they triggered review. Files were revisited, timelines were re-examined, past assurances were weighed against public outcomes, and somewhere in that process, a conclusion was reinforced rather than challenged. Here's the contradiction Meghan may not have anticipated. By lowering the temperature, she removed urgency. And without urgency, institutions default to inertia. Silence became easier. Deferral became safer. Non-response became policy. One source described it this way: the palace didn't reject the outreach, it absorbed it. And absorption is far more dangerous than refusal, because refusal invites revision. Absorption leads to disappearance. Now let's talk about the moment everything crystallized. According to insiders, there was one intermediary Meghan believed could still bridge the gap. Someone trusted, someone discreet, someone who had navigated sensitive territory before. The message wasn't dramatic. It wasn't emotional, it was pragmatic. A question, essentially: is there any appetite for recalibration? Not a return. Not a reconciliation tour, just a recalibration. And the response? Nothing. Not a no. Not a not now. Just silence. And in palace language, silence is not passive. It's conclusive. That's when Meghan reportedly realized something fundamental had shifted. Not externally, internally. The palace was no longer managing her as a risk. It was managing her as a resolved matter. That's a brutal distinction, because when you're seen as a risk, you're still relevant. You still require monitoring, containment, response. When you're seen as resolved, you're archived. That realization triggered the final strategic pivot. Publicly, nothing changed overnight. There were no dramatic reversals, no sudden confessions, no apologies issued into the void. But behind the scenes, the tone hardened again, not with aggression, but with urgency, because Meghan understood she wasn't negotiating anymore. She was running out of time. And this is where the story becomes deeply ironic. The very restraint that was meant to make reconciliation possible may have convinced the palace that reconciliation was unnecessary, because institutions don't respond to vulnerability unless vulnerability aligns with their interests. And in this case, the palace's interest was stability, continuity, closure, which raises an uncomfortable question. Did Meghan's quiet shift come too late? Sources suggest that by the time outreach softened, the palace had already moved past the idea of re-engagement entirely, not out of spite, but out of exhaustion. Years of public back and forth had created a simple internal conclusion: engagement equals amplification, and amplification was no longer tolerable. So when Meghan stopped amplifying, the palace didn't lean in, it leaned out. That's the paradox at the heart of this chapter. The more she tried to de-escalate, the more the institution disengaged. And the more it disengaged, the clearer it became that this wasn't about forgiveness. It was about finality. Now ask yourself this: if you believed there was still a path back, however narrow, would you issue a statement like the one we discussed earlier? Or would you keep silence intact, preserving flexibility? The palace chose to speak, which suggests the internal calculus was already complete. And that's why the tragic update landed when it did. Not as a reaction to Meghan's strategy shift, but as confirmation that the shift hadn't changed the outcome. One insider put it bluntly: by the time the tone softened, the window had closed. That doesn't mean Meghan didn't try. It means she misread the clock. Institutions don't operate on emotional timelines. They operate on structural ones. And once a structure is dismantled, you don't rebuild it with goodwill alone. You need leverage. And leverage in this case was gone. Which brings us to the most painful part of all. Sources say Meghan didn't learn this through confrontation. She learned it through absence, through the gradual realization that there was no one left to persuade, no one left to convince, no one left to appeal to. The palace wasn't saying no, it was saying nothing. And nothing, in royal terms, is final. That realization reframes everything that followed: the tragic language, the procedural tone, the confirmation without compassion. They weren't dismissals, they were markers. Markers of a transition from engagement to history. And here's where the tension spikes again. Because just as Meghan's strategy shifted, something else was happening behind palace walls. A debate. Not about whether to re-engage, that question had already been answered, but about how to manage the end of the story, how to prevent future claims, how to avoid being drawn back into cycles of narrative warfare. And that debate produced a line, a single warning, delivered privately, That explains why the palace no longer fears escalation, because it believes escalation no longer works. And once you hear that warning, you understand why Meghan's quieter strategy wasn't met with relief. It was met with resolve. What if there was never meant to be a return at all? What if the so-called secret return plan wasn't a comeback, a reconciliation, or even a second chance, but something far more limited, far more cautious, and far more fragile than anyone on the outside imagined? Because once you strip away the speculation, the wishful thinking, and the click-driven headlines, what emerges is not a plan built on hope. It's a plan built on containment. And that distinction changes everything. Here's the first truth that needs to be said plainly. There was no grand proposal on the table, no formal invitation, no pathway back into royal life as the public understands it, no balcony, no ceremonies, no restoration of status. What existed, briefly, was an idea, an internal concept, a theoretical framework designed to answer a single question the palace could no longer avoid. How do you neutralize a long-term narrative risk without reigniting it? That was the problem the institution was trying to solve, not how to welcome someone back, not how to repair a relationship, but how to reduce volatility. And somewhere inside that conversation, the phrase limited re-engagement entered the room. That's the origin of the so-called secret return plan. Not a return in the traditional sense. A recalibration, a narrowing of distance just enough to lower the temperature, not enough to reopen wounds. Sources describe it less like an olive branch and more like a pressure valve, a way to stop the system from overheating. The idea was deceptively simple. If the institution could reframe the relationship as dormant, but civil, not hostile, not active, it could deprive future narratives of oxygen. No feud, no rejection, no drama, just nothing. And nothing for an institution is stability. Now here's where the misunderstanding begins. On the outside, any hint of contact gets interpreted as progress, as movement toward reconciliation, as proof that time heals all things. Inside the palace, contact does not mean commitment. It means assessment. And this particular assessment was never about emotion. It was about risk. The internal discussion focused on 3 questions. Would limited re-engagement reduce public escalation? Would it create new obligations? And most critically, could it be controlled? That last question is where everything collapsed, because control is non-negotiable for institutions. And control was the one thing the palace no longer believed it had. According to multiple accounts, the idea floated was narrow to the point of austerity. No public appearances, no formal roles, no symbolic gestures that could be framed as endorsement. At most, a private understanding, a reclassification of status, a mutual agreement to disengage quietly rather than noisily. This was not about letting someone back in. It was about drawing a thinner, quieter line. But here's the problem. Even a line that thin requires trust. And trust was the one resource that had been fully depleted. Because from the palace's perspective, every prior attempt at boundary setting had eventually become content, material, narrative fuel. Private moments had become public memory. Controlled access had turned into global discussion. So when the idea of limited re-engagement surfaced, it immediately triggered a secondary question. What's the enforcement mechanism? How do you ensure that what stays private stays private? How do you prevent a quiet understanding from becoming a public episode? No one had a satisfying answer. And that's when the plan stopped being a plan and became a liability. But let's be clear about something important. The idea didn't die because of spite. It didn't die because of pride. It died because of precedent. Institutions live and die by precedent. And the precedent here was unforgiving. Every previous attempt at quiet management had resulted in louder fallout. Every concession had produced an escalation, not a resolution. So even the most cautious voices inside the system began to ask the same question. If limited engagement creates even a 10% chance of renewed narrative warfare, is that acceptable? The answer was no. Not because of personal feelings, but because the institution had already absorbed too much damage. And here's the detail that most people don't know. The idea of limited re-engagement was never unanimous. It was contentious from the start. Some saw it as pragmatic, others saw it as dangerous, and one faction saw it as unnecessary. Because from their perspective, the situation had already stabilized. Public attention was waning. Media cycles were moving on. The noise, while still present, was no longer destabilizing. Why reintroduce uncertainty? Why reopen a door that no one was banging on anymore? That argument gained traction fast, and once it did, the entire framework collapsed under its own weight. Because a return plan that exists to solve a problem ceases to exist once the problem appears to be resolving itself. And that's when the condition was introduced. The condition that insiders say ended everything, not formally, not publicly, but decisively. The condition was simple. Any form of re-engagement would require absolute confidence that future communications would remain private. No reinterpretation, no reframing, no delayed disclosures, no memoirs, no documentaries, no context years later. Silence, in perpetuity, that was the line. And that line was never crossed, not because of refusal, but because of reality. There was no mechanism to enforce it, no trust left to underpin it, and no appetite to gamble the institution's future on personal assurances. So the idea stalled, then froze, then quietly disappeared. Which brings us back to the palace statement, because once the internal conclusion was reached, that even limited re-engagement posed unacceptable risk, the question became how to manage perception, how to ensure that the absence of return could not be reframed as cruelty, how to close the loop without igniting backlash. That's when the language hardened. That's when tragic entered the frame. That's when confirmation replaced ambiguity. The statement was not announcing the end of a plan. It was announcing that there had never been one, at least not one that survived scrutiny. And this is where the emotional irony becomes impossible to ignore. The very restraint Meghan adopted, the quieter tone, the indirect outreach, the attempt to signal maturity, came after the institution had already decided restraint wasn't enough. Because the problem wasn't tone. It was history. And history cannot be edited by intent alone. Now consider this carefully. If the palace believed there was still a viable pathway, however narrow, would it risk hardening public language? Or would it preserve ambiguity to protect future options? The answer tells you everything you need to know. Ambiguity was no longer useful, which means options were no longer needed. And yet, and this is where the story tightens, not everyone accepted that conclusion quietly. There were dissenting voices. People who believed that complete disengagement carried its own risks. People who worried that silence could be interpreted as indifference, that absence could harden into myth. Those voices didn't win. But they did force one final consideration. How do you ensure that the end of engagement doesn't become the beginning of a new grievance narrative? That's when the concept of documentation emerged, not in the public sense, in the institutional sense. Language that could be pointed to later. Language that showed acknowledgement without obligation, recognition without re-entry. That's the function the statement served. It wasn't for now. It was for later. For the moment when someone might say, "We tried." The palace could respond calmly and factually. The situation was recognized. It was addressed. It was tragic. And it was closed. That's not emotion, that's insurance. Which brings us to the most unsettling revelation of all. According to insiders, the final internal conversation about limited re-engagement didn't end with anger. It ended with relief. Relief that the uncertainty was over. Relief that the institution could stop anticipating the next escalation. Relief that a line had finally been drawn, not loudly, not cruelly, but definitively. And once that relief set in, there was no going back. Because institutions don't reopen debates they believe are settled. They move on. And that's the moment the so-called return plan truly died. Not with a rejection, but with a shrug. A collective decision that the cost of reopening was higher than the cost of letting go. Which raises the most difficult question of all. If the palace no longer fears escalation, if it no longer believes engagement is necessary, If it no longer sees leverage on the other side, then what does that mean for everything that comes next? Because sources say that once the return plan was quietly shelved, a different strategy replaced it. Not reconciliation, not containment, but something colder, something far more final. Action Lab, and it was communicated internally with a sentence so blunt that even seasoned courtiers were stunned. A sentence that explains why the palace now believes it holds the upper hand permanently. That sentence didn't make it into any statement, but it changed how every future interaction would be handled. And once you hear it, you'll understand why the door didn't just close. It vanished. Why would an institution built on survival choose permanent refusal over conditional mercy? Because from the palace's point of view, this was no longer a personal dilemma. It was a structural one. And structures don't forgive, they adapt. By the time the idea of limited re-engagement had quietly dissolved, the internal conversation had moved somewhere colder, more strategic, and far less emotional than the public ever imagined. The question was no longer whether Meghan could be trusted again. That debate had exhausted itself. The real question became this: is it safer to reopen a door once, or to weld it shut forever? Inside institutions that measure time in decades, not headlines, that question carries enormous weight. One wrong decision doesn't just cause embarrassment, it reshapes precedent. It teaches future actors what is possible. It weakens boundaries that may never be restored. And that's why, according to multiple insiders, the palace began leaning toward a conclusion that would have seemed unthinkable years earlier. No return. Ever. Not loudly declared, not dramatically announced, but operationally enforced. Because in the palace's calculus, permanence creates stability. Let's unpack that. Institutions fear uncertainty more than backlash. Backlash fades. Uncertainty lingers. It forces constant vigilance, endless recalibration, reactive decision-making. And the monarchy, above all else, is designed to avoid reaction. For years, Meghan represented uncertainty, not because of malice, but because of unpredictability. Every attempt at containment had produced new variables. Every silence had been reframed. Every boundary had been tested. And over time, that constant state of readiness became unsustainable. So when the option of limited re-engagement fell apart, the palace didn't scramble for alternatives. It simplified. If engagement creates volatility, disengagement creates calm. That logic may sound harsh, but institutions are not built to be kind. They are built to endure. Now here's where the reasoning becomes brutally clear. A conditional yes is dangerous because conditions can be renegotiated. A temporary arrangement invites future appeals. A limited role creates the expectation of expansion. But a permanent no? A permanent no eliminates the problem entirely. No negotiations, no future leverage, no reopening of wounds, just time doing what time does best, moving on. One insider described it this way: the palace wasn't punishing Meghan, it was removing her from the equation. That distinction matters. Punishment implies emotion. Retaliation, moral judgment. Removal implies strategy. And strategy is colder. By saying no forever, the palace ensured that it would never again have to manage the optics of saying no later. No annual reassessments. No public will, they won't, they cycles. No pressure to respond to shifting narratives. The decision collapsed infinite future problems into a single moment of resolve. And once that resolve formed, everything else followed naturally. Language hardened. Ambiguity disappeared. Finality crept into tone. That's why the statement didn't feel like a negotiation. It felt like a footnote. But let's talk about fear. Because fear was absolutely part of this decision. Not fear of Meghan herself, fear of precedent. If the palace allowed even the smallest form of reintegration after years of public rupture, what would that signal to future members? That public dissent eventually pays off? That institutions can be pressured through media escalation? That boundaries are temporary if you wait long enough? That lesson would be catastrophic. Because once precedent is set, it cannot be selectively enforced. If one person returns after burning bridges publicly, others will expect the same grace. And the monarchy cannot survive if loyalty becomes optional. So the safest move was the most extreme one: close the door completely. Not as punishment, as prevention. Now consider the emotional cost of this choice. Was there sympathy internally? Yes. Was there discomfort? Absolutely. But sympathy does not override institutional memory. And the palace remembers everything. It remembers the interviews, the contradictions, the moments when private conversations became public spectacle, the way carefully managed narratives were disrupted. The erosion of trust didn't happen once, it happened repeatedly. And repeated erosion leads to structural collapse. So the logic hardened. Better to endure accusations of coldness now than instability forever. Better to be accused of being unforgiving than to risk being uncontainable. That's the logic that prevailed. And once it did, the internal messaging shifted accordingly. No more discussions about reintegration. No more contingency planning. No more hypothetical frameworks. The file moved from active to resolved. That change may sound bureaucratic, but it is decisive. Because once something is marked resolved, it is no longer debated. It becomes reference material, history. And here's the part that's most difficult to hear. Insiders say the palace believes this decision ultimately protects Meghan as much as it protects itself. How? By removing false hope. By ending cycles of anticipation and disappointment. By drawing a line so clear that no one can misinterpret it. From the palace's perspective, ambiguity was cruelty. Finality was mercy. That belief may feel deeply ironic, even offensive, to those who see the situation as personal. But institutions rarely see individuals the way individuals see themselves. They see patterns. And the pattern here was unsustainable. So the palace chose permanence. And once permanence is chosen, everything else becomes easier. Communications becomes simpler. Responses become unnecessary. Silence becomes policy rather than strategy. That's why the tragic language mattered. That's why confirmation replaced deflection. That's why the statement didn't invite conversation. It closed it. Now pause and ask yourself something difficult. If you believed that any engagement, even well-intentioned, carried unacceptable risk, if you believed that reopening doors would destabilize the institution, if you believed that the safest future was one where this chapter simply ended, would you really do anything differently? That's the question insiders grappled with, and ultimately they answered no. Which leads us to the most unsettling consequence of all. Once the palace commits to a permanent no, it no longer needs to monitor reactions. It no longer needs to manage tone. It no longer needs to anticipate escalation. Because from its point of view, escalation has lost its power. There is nothing left to win. And that belief fundamentally changes how the institution behaves. It stops responding. It stops signaling. It stops caring how actions are interpreted by the other side. That's not cruelty. That's detachment. And detachment is the end state of all institutional conflict. Which brings us to the next development. Because once the palace decided that no return would ever be acceptable, it had to confront a secondary issue. How do you manage internal disagreement? Because not everyone was comfortable with such finality. Some worried about optics, others worried about long-term narrative fallout, a few worried about the human cost. Those concerns didn't reverse the decision, but they did shape the next phase, a phase that involved internal division, quiet dissent, and a debate that almost cracked the united front. And that debate produced something unexpected, a split. Not loud, not public, but profound. Because while the institution agreed on the outcome, it did not agree on the reasoning. And that internal divide would soon surface in subtle ways that suggest the story may not be as settled as it appears. Not because the palace will change its mind, but because disagreement inside power structures never disappears. It waits. And in the next chapter, we'll expose that divide. Who stood where, why it mattered, and how a single disagreement nearly unraveled the illusion of unanimity. Because when institutions fracture internally, the consequences are never immediate, but they are always consequential. Why now? Why at this moment, after years of uncertainty, did the palace decide to make the statement that changed everything. Timing, insiders say, is not accidental, it is deliberate. And in the case of Meghan Markle's future, timing wasn't about her. It was about the institution. Because in the palace's world, timing is power. It dictates perception, manages expectation, and controls narrative. Every word, every press release, every carefully constructed phrase is calibrated against not just today's headlines, but decades of precedent. And in this case, timing was everything. Sources reveal that the statement dropped at the exact moment when speculation about Meghan's potential re-engagement was reaching its peak. Public conversation had been swirling for weeks. Rumors of intermediaries, quiet messages, and behind-the-scenes signals of possible rapprochement. The palace had observed these signals, measured their potential for destabilization, and then acted. Not to respond to Meghan, but to preempt a narrative. Because the risk wasn't immediate, it was anticipatory. Once the public or the media begins to believe a comeback is possible, momentum grows exponentially. Headlines compound. Social media amplifies perception. Supporters and detractors alike construct arguments around the possibility of her return. And before long, the institution would have been forced to react on the public stage, a place where control is impossible. So, timing became the lever. Drop the statement now, insiders argued, and you shape perception before speculation becomes expectation. Too early, and the public wouldn't understand its weight. Too late, and the palace loses the opportunity to frame the narrative. Too early, and you risk reigniting public outrage. There is a precise moment, and apparently, the palace hit it. And the precision of timing was reflected in the careful construction of the statement itself. The use of tragic and confirmed, words we've already dissected, were not only about content, but about context. By releasing the statement at this precise moment, the palace ensured that these words would carry maximum weight, limiting misinterpretation and reducing the room for alternative readings. Consider the broader context. In the months leading up to this statement, the palace had been managing multiple crises: global media narratives, royal family dynamics, political sensitivities, and public perception. Meghan's potential return or re-engagement threatened to intersect with all of these vectors. Any move, any hint of approval, could ripple outward, creating complications that would last years. Timing, therefore, was not just about Meghan. It was about aligning the palace's internal and external ecosystems to maintain equilibrium. But timing also serves another purpose: psychological leverage. By releasing the statement when public anticipation was highest, the palace forced Meghan into a reactive position. She could no longer control the narrative. She could no longer quietly explore options. The message was clear: the clock was no longer hers to manipulate. She was now subject to the timing and decisions of the institution. Insiders note that timing also amplified impact internally. Staff, courtiers, and other family members were observing the situation. By choosing the moment carefully, the palace reinforced hierarchy and internal discipline. It demonstrated that decisions are made with strategic foresight, not emotion, and that attempts to circumvent the system would be observed and mitigated. And here's where the subtlety becomes crucial. Timing didn't just maximize leverage over Meghan. It minimized fallout elsewhere. By carefully selecting the moment, the palace controlled the optics. Public attention was high enough to register importance, but not so high that the statement risked overshadowing other events. The media cycle would process it, but not dominate it, allowing the institution to maintain balance across its broader narrative ecosystem. Timing also intersects with precedent. Previous instances of perceived leniency had created expectations that the palace could not allow to continue. In effect, releasing the statement at this precise moment reset expectations. The window for interpretation, negotiation, or engagement had definitively closed. By controlling the temporal context, the palace signaled both internally and externally that the story had entered a new phase, one in which previous patterns no longer applied. Now here's where emotion and timing collide. Publicly, the statement felt cold, calculated, even distant, but that distance was intentional. By releasing it now, the palace forced a recalibration of emotional perception. Meghan's supporters experienced surprise, confusion, and disappointment. Critics were momentarily validated. Insiders recognized strategy, and the broader public interpreted the update as a turning point, even if they couldn't fully articulate why. Timing amplified these emotional effects. But timing is double-edged. A poorly chosen moment can provoke backlash. Too soon, and you appear reactive. Too late, and the story is already written by others. Too carefully, and critics accuse you of manipulation. The palace's decision demonstrates their acute understanding of this risk. The statement was delivered at the narrow window where maximum control intersects with minimum exposure. Sources also highlight the internal discussions that preceded this decision. The timing wasn't spontaneous. It followed weeks of analysis, media monitoring, internal council discussions, risk assessments, and strategic simulations. Every possible consequence was mapped. The final moment of release was chosen not for expediency, but for calculated advantage. The only timing that could serve both perception and institutional stability simultaneously. And here's the final insight about timing. It is irreversible once acted upon. The moment the statement went public, the palace's position was locked. Any reversal would imply indecision, any delay would imply weakness, and any misalignment would create opportunities for misinterpretation. By controlling the moment of release, the palace effectively set the tempo for the next chapter of the story, one in which Meghan's options were severely constrained and the institution's authority remained unchallenged. So ask yourself this: was timing merely incidental, or was it the quiet, invisible hand that transformed a simple statement into a turning point? Because the sources suggest the latter, that without precise timing, the tragic confirmation might have been less effective, less contained, less final. Timing, in this case, was not just strategy, it was power. And yet, despite all this precision, insiders warn that the story is far from over. Timing has sealed certain pathways, yes, but it has also created pressures elsewhere: internal disagreements, emerging dissenting voices, and the subtle ripple effects of perceived rigidity. These factors, invisible to the public, may yet shape the next moves of the institution and of Meghan herself. In other words, timing did its work. It framed the moment, reinforced authority, and amplified effect. But the consequences of that timing are still unfolding, quietly, behind closed doors. Every move in Meghan's quiet outreach wasn't made alone. Every signal, every subtle attempt at rebuilding ties passed through intermediaries, people carefully selected for discretion, credibility, and access. And